The sun hung low over the mesa, bleeding copper and crimson across a land that knew only extremes, blistering heat or bone-deep cold, merciless drought or sudden violence. The cowboy rode alone through the broken country, his horse picking carefully between sage and stone. When he saw the body crumpled against the rocks, at first he thought it was a dead man. The stillness suggested it. The vultures circling overhead confirmed the assumption. But as he drew closer, reins tightening in his calloused hands, he saw the chest rise barely painfully and fall again. An Apache. The realization struck him like a fist. The man's dark hair was matted with blood and dust, his clothing torn, a bullet wound seeping red into the dry earth beneath him. His face, even in unconsciousness, carried the hard lines of someone who had lived violently and expected to die the same way. The cowboy knew this face. Everyone in the territory knew it. This was the outlaw they called Ghost Walker, the man who had raided settlements, burned supply wagons, killed soldiers and settlers alike in a war that had no clear beginning and would have no clean end. The cowboy sat motionless on his horse, caught between instincts that warred inside him like two wolves tearing at the same meal. Right away, survival demanded it. Logic demanded it. This man was a killer, a threat, someone the army would hang without trial if they found him breathing. But something else stirred in the cowboy's chest, something older than reason, deeper than fear. He saw not an enemy, but a man dying alone in the dirt, and the weight of that sight pressed down on him with unexpected force. He dismounted. The decision was made before he fully understood it, his boots hitting the ground with a soft crunch that seemed too loud in the vast silence. He knelt beside the Apache, checking the wound, feeling for the pulse at his throat. It was there, faint, stubborn, refusing to quit. The cowboy looked around at the empty land, the distant mountains like the broken teeth of some ancient beast, and he knew that saving this man would cost him everything, his safety, his reputation, perhaps his life. But he had already made his choice. The cowboy had been alone for so long that solitude had become a second skin, something he wore without noticing. He worked on a small ranch at the edge of the frontier, a place where the land was too harsh for most and the isolation too complete for anyone who craved human company. He preferred it that way. The world had taught him that people brought complications, betrayals, pain that lasted longer than any physical wound. Out here, with only his horse and the endless sky, he could exist without the weight of others' expectations or judgments. He had come west after the war, not the recent Indian wars, but the great civil war that had torn the nation apart and left men like him adrift, unmoored from whatever they had been before. He rarely thought about those years anymore. The memories were smoke, drifting and formless, carrying the smell of something burned beyond recognition. He had rebuilt himself here in the wilderness, piece by piece, into someone simple. A man who worked with his hands, who knew the feel of leather and rope, who could read weather in the clouds and trouble in the way his horse's ears moved. Now as he lifted the Apache onto his horse with a grunt of effort, feeling the dead weight of the unconscious man settle against the saddle, he wondered if he was destroying that carefully constructed solitude. The outlaw's head lolled forward, blood dripping slowly onto the horse's dark mane. The animal shifted nervously, smelling the blood, sensing the wrongness of the situation. The cowboy murmured soft words, meaningless sounds meant only to calm, and began leading the horse toward the only shelter he knew, a line shack 3 miles north, a place he used during winter roundups, isolated and forgotten by everyone except him. The journey was slow torture. Every step felt measured against a ticking clock he couldn't see, but could feel in his bones. The sun moved across the sky with agonizing slowness, and the land offered no mercy, no shade, no water, no place to hide if someone came looking. He thought about the Apache's reputation, the stories told in saloons and around campfires, tales that had probably grown with each telling. Ghost Walker. The name itself carried weight, suggested something more than human. They said he moved like smoke, struck like lightning, disappeared before men could even aim their rifles. They said he had killed 20 men, or 50, or 100. The number changed depending on who was drinking and who was listening. But the man draped over the horse was just that, a man. Flesh and blood and pain, wounded and vulnerable. The cowboy had seen enough death to know that everyone died the same way in the end, regardless of reputation or fear or legend. And yet the stories haunted him as he walked. He was saving a killer. That truth couldn't be ignored or softened. Whatever drove Ghost Walker, vengeance, survival, hatred, or something else entirely, the result was the same. Men had died by his hand, perhaps good men, perhaps men with families. The thought made the cowboy's jaw tighten, made his grip on the reins harder than necessary. But he kept walking. He had made his choice at that moment by the rocks, and he was not a man who went back on his choices, no matter how much they cost him. The lined shack appeared as the sun began its final descent, a crude structure of weathered wood and stone that looked like it had grown from the earth itself. The cowboy led the horse inside the small attached lean-to, then carefully lowered the Apache to the ground, dragging him into the shack with arms that burned from the effort. He laid him on the single cot, then stood for a moment, breathing hard, looking down at the man whose life now rested in his hands. The wound needed cleaning. The bullet needed to come out if it was still in there. The cowboy had done field medicine before. The war had taught every soldier to be part doctor, part butcher, but never for an enemy. Never for someone he might have shot himself under different circumstances. He built a small fire, heated water in a battered pot, and gathered what supplies he had. Whiskey for cleaning, a knife for cutting, strips of cloth for bandaging. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but his mind churned with questions that had no good answers. Why are you doing this? The question echoed in the silence of the shack as he worked, cutting away the Apache's bloodied shirt, cleaning the wound with careful precision. The bullet had gone through a blessing that saved him from digging in the damaged flesh. The cowboy worked steadily, methodically, the way he did everything, while outside the darkness gathered and the coyotes began their evening song. When he finished, the Apache's breathing had steadied slightly, his fever less violent. The cowboy sat back against the rough wall, exhausted, and stared at the man he had saved. An unspoken bond had formed in that act of mercy, invisible but real as the rope that connected horse to rider. Two men, born into circumstances that made them enemies, now tied together by a choice that defied all logic. The cowboy knew he would pay for this choice. He just didn't know the price yet. The Apache woke on the third day. The cowboy was outside when it happened, checking on his horse and scanning the horizon, a habit born from years of living where danger could appear from any direction. He returned to find the outlaw conscious, dark eyes open and alert, despite the pain that must have been screaming through his body. Those eyes tracked the cowboy's movement with an intensity that was almost physical, assessing, calculating, measuring threat and intent in the space of seconds. Neither man spoke. The cowboy had no Apache words, and he doubted Ghost Walker would waste English on him even if he knew it, but language seemed unnecessary. The Apache's eyes moved from the cowboy to the bandages on his own chest, to the small space of the shack, to the rifle leaning against the far wall, too far to reach, deliberately placed. Understanding passed between them without words. The cowboy had saved him. The cowboy could have killed him. The cowboy had chosen mercy. The outlaw's face revealed nothing. It was a face carved from stone, hardened by years of violence and survival, showing no gratitude or relief or even curiosity. Just watchfulness. Just waiting. The cowboy brought water, helped him drink, then returned to his work without expecting thanks. Something in him understood that this man's pride was all he had left, and forcing acknowledgement would be a cruelty worse than letting him die. Over the following days, a rhythm developed between them, as natural and wordless as the cycle of sunrise and sunset. The cowboy tended the wound, brought food and water, maintained the fire. The Apache watched, regained strength, and slowly began to move with more ease. Sometimes the cowboy would catch him staring at the distant mountains visible through the shack's small window, and he wondered what the outlaw was thinking. Was he remembering his people, planning escape, calculating revenge? The face never revealed anything, remained a mask carved from the same unforgiving stone as the land itself. But there were small moments, brief, almost imperceptible, when the mask slipped. When the cowboy brought fresh water, and the Apache's eyes showed something that might have been respect. When pain forced a grimace, and the cowboy adjusted his position without being asked. And gratitude flickered across the hard features before disappearing. When the fire burned low in the night, and both men stared into the flames, and the space between them felt less like the divide between enemies, and more like the simple companionship of two souls surviving the darkness together. The cowboy found himself wondering about Ghostwalker's life, the path that had led him here, bleeding and hunted. He knew the Apache had been fighting a war, but so had everyone in this territory. The settlers fought for land and safety. The soldiers fought for duty and glory. The Apache fought for survival, for a way of life being systematically destroyed. The cowboy had tried to stay out of it, had believed that isolation could protect him from choosing sides. Now, sitting across from this wounded warrior, he realized that neutrality was a lie he had told himself. Saving Ghostwalker was choosing a side. The consequences would come. They came on the 8th day. The cowboy was outside splitting wood when he heard the horse's multiple riders moving fast. His blood went cold. He dropped the axe and moved quickly to the lean-to, scanning the horizon through gaps in the weathered boards. 4 men, maybe 5, riding hard from the east. Soldiers or settlers, he couldn't tell yet, but their purpose was clear. They were searching for something. Or someone. He ducked back into the shack. The Apache was already standing, despite the pain it must have caused, his body tense and ready. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the cowboy saw the truth reflected back at him. This was the price. This was what mercy cost. He could turn Ghostwalker over, claim he had captured him, maybe salvage his reputation. Or he could protect the man he had saved, knowing it would mark him as an accomplice, a traitor to his own kind. The choice should have been impossible. But the cowboy realized it wasn't a choice at all. He had made it days ago when he knelt beside a dying man in the dust. Everything since then had been consequence, inevitable as gravity. He grabbed his rifle and positioned himself by the window, and the Apache understood. The outlaw moved to the far corner, out of sight from the door, his body coiled despite his injury. Together, without words, they prepared to face whatever came next. The riders stopped 50 yards from the shack. 5 men, not soldiers but settlers, ranchers, or townsmen, the kind of men who formed posses and called it justice. The cowboy recognized the leader, a hard man named Garrett, who owned a large spread to the south, someone who had lost stock to raids and wore his hatred openly. Garrett called out, his voice carrying across the empty space. The words didn't matter. The tone said everything. They were looking for the Apache. They had tracked him here. They expected cooperation. The cowboy stepped outside, rifle held casually but ready, and his presence announced his position clearer than any words could. He stood in front of the shack, blocking the door, his face set in lines of quiet determination. Garrett's expression shifted from expectation to confusion to anger in the space of heartbeats. More words were shouted, accusations, demands, threats. The cowboy said nothing. His silence was its own declaration. The standoff stretched, tension thickening until it felt solid enough to touch. The settlers had rifles. They had numbers, but they also had uncertainty. The cowboy was one of them, white, a settler himself, someone who had lived peacefully among them. His betrayal made no sense, disrupted their simple narrative of good and evil, us and them. They hadn't come prepared to kill one of their own. That hesitation saved both men's lives. Garrett spat into the dust, said something final and bitter, and the posse turned their horses. But they would be back, the cowboy knew, with more men, with soldiers, with ropes and certainty. The message was clear. He had made himself an enemy. He had chosen the wrong side. There would be consequences. As the riders disappeared into the shimmering heat, the cowboy felt the weight of what he had done settle onto his shoulders like a physical burden. He had just destroyed the life he had carefully built, the solitude, the safety, the simple existence. For what? For a man he didn't know, couldn't speak to, who had killed men like him. He turned back to the shack, and the Apache was standing in the doorway, watching him with those unfathomable dark eyes. For the first time, something passed between them that was more than survival or strategy, recognition. One warrior acknowledging another. One man understanding what another had sacrificed. The unspoken bond deepened, became something neither could name but both could feel. They were tied together now, committed to whatever came next. The cowboy nodded once, and the Apache returned it, a gesture so small it might have been imagined, but weighted with meaning that filled the space between them. They had maybe a day, maybe two, before the settlers returned with reinforcements. The cowboy knew they had to move. Ghost Walker couldn't stay here, and neither could he. The question was where they could go in a territory that had just declared them both enemies. That night, as they prepared to leave, the cowboy found himself staring at the Apache across the dying fire, wondering at the strange path that had brought them to this moment. He had come west seeking isolation, wanting nothing from the world except to be left alone. Now he was hunted, tied to an outlaw, facing an uncertain future that promised only hardship and danger. And yet, something in him felt more alive than he had in years. The war had hollowed him out, left him functioning but empty. This act of mercy and its consequences had reminded him that he was more than survival, more than solitude. He was capable of sacrifice, of choosing principle over safety, of standing for something, even when it cost him everything. The Apache watched him across the flames, and the cowboy wondered if the outlaw understood any of this. Probably not. Their worlds were too different, their languages unbridged by words. But perhaps understanding wasn't necessary. Perhaps the bond they had forged was built on something simpler. One man helping another because it was right, regardless of cost. The fire burned low. The coyotes sang their ancient songs. And two men enemies by birth, allies by choice, prepared to frontier would throw at them next. They left before dawn, moving through darkness that felt less like concealment and more like a presence watching their escape. The cowboy led his horse on foot, the Apache riding despite his protests, too weak still for the hard journey ahead. They moved north, away from settlements and known trails, into country that was more rock than soil, more vertical than flat, where water was scarce and shelter even scarcer. The land itself seemed to resist their passage. Ancient canyons cut through the earth like wounds that had never healed, forcing detours that added hours to their travel. Flash floods had carved channels that couldn't be crossed directly, requiring careful navigation around cliff edges where one misstep would mean a fatal fall. The sun, when it rose, beat down with a fury that felt personal, and the Apache's fever returned with the heat, turning his skin hot and dry, his breathing shallow. The cowboy watched him carefully, worry gnawing at his gut. Saving Ghost Walker only to watch him die slowly from infection would be a cruel irony. But he had no medicine, no clean water except what they could find in rare springs, no way to rest long enough for proper healing. They had to keep moving. Behind them, he knew, the settlers were organizing. Word would have spread. The cowboy who had turned traitor. The Apache who should have died. A manhunt was forming, growing with each passing hour like a storm building on the horizon. By midday, the Apache was slumping in the saddle, consciousness drifting. The cowboy called a halt in the shade of an overhanging cliff, helped the outlaw down, and let him rest while he scouted ahead. The country was impossible, all vertical drops and dead ends, as if the earth itself was conspiring to trap them. He found a narrow path that might lead deeper into the canyons, but it would mean committing fully to a route with no guarantee of water or escape. When he returned, the Apache was awake, dark eyes watching him approach. The fever had painted bright spots of color on his cheeks, made his gaze slightly unfocused. The cowboy offered water from his canteen, and the outlaw drank, then gestured toward the mountains to the west with a slight movement of his chin. The meaning was clear: his people's territory. Safety if they could reach it. But it was days away, across some of the hardest country in the territory, and the Apache might not survive the journey. The cowboy nodded understanding and helped him back onto the horse. They had no choice but to try. The afternoon became a test of endurance that pushed both men past their limits. The heat was monstrous, turning the canyon walls into radiating ovens that baked them from all sides. The horse struggled on the rocky terrain, stumbling occasionally, and each time the Apache would grunt in pain as the jarring motion reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. The cowboy's own exhaustion became a constant companion, his legs burning, his throat raw from dust and too little water. But he kept moving, kept driving them forward, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant the sacrifice had been for nothing. As the sun finally began its descent, painting the canyon walls in shades of blood and gold, they came upon a sight that stopped the cowboy dead in his tracks. Below them, spread across a rare flat space where a spring created a small oasis, was an army patrol. 6 soldiers, maybe 8, their horses picketed near the water, their camp showing they intended to stay the night. The cowboy's heart sank. They needed that water desperately. The Apache was burning with fever, and the horse was near collapse, but riding down into that camp would be suicide. The soldiers would shoot first and investigate later, especially if they had heard about Ghostwalker being in the area. He backed away carefully, leading the horse deeper into the shadows of the canyon. The Apache had seen them too, had understood the implications. When the cowboy looked up at him, he saw resignation in those fever-bright eyes, a warrior's acceptance of fate. The outlaw was preparing to die, the cowboy realized. He expected this to be the end. But the cowboy wasn't ready to accept that ending, not after everything they had been through, not after the price he had already paid. As darkness fell completely, he formed a desperate plan. The soldiers would have posted sentries, but tired men in the middle of nowhere often grew complacent. If he could reach the spring, fill their canteens, get back without being seen, it was possible. Barely, a fool's chance at best. He settled the Apache in a protected hollow between rocks, made sure he was as comfortable as possible, then checked his knife and began the slow descent toward the soldiers' camp. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat feeling loud enough to give him away. He moved the way he had learned during the war, slow, deliberate, using every shadow and stone for cover. The spring was maybe 200 yards from the main camp, just far enough that someone could reach it without being directly observed. The first sentry was positioned poorly, more focused on the camp's fire than the darkness beyond it. The cowboy slipped past him like smoke, his movements born from skills he had hoped never to use again. The spring was a whisper of sound in the darkness, water trickling over rocks with a gentle music that seemed obscenely peaceful given the circumstances. He filled both canteens as quietly as possible, the water cold and perfect against his hands. Just as he finished, he heard voices soldiers approaching to refill their own canteens. The cowboy froze, every muscle locked, barely breathing as 2 men came within 10 feet of where he crouched in shadow. They spoke casually about card games and women and complaints about their commanding officer, oblivious to the enemy listening from the darkness. When they finally left, the cowboy waited 10 more agonizing minutes before beginning his retreat. The climb back up to where he had left the Apache seemed to take hours, each stone potentially loose enough to rattle and give him away, each shadow potentially hiding another sentry. But luck or something beyond luck held, and he made it back to find the Apache exactly where he had left him, conscious but barely, his fever raging unchecked. The cowboy helped him drink, the water bringing some small relief to the parched throat and burning body. Then he wet his bandana and pressed it to the Apache's forehead, providing what comfort he could in their desperate situation. They couldn't stay here. The soldiers might patrol wider in the morning. But moving in the dark through this terrain was nearly impossible, and the Apache might not survive being jostled again so soon. So they waited, huddled in their rocky hollow while below them the soldiers slept, and above them the stars wheeled through the ancient sky. The cowboy dozed in fits, always jerking awake at imagined sounds, his rifle held ready across his lap. Sometime near midnight, the Apache began to shake violent tremors that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with his body fighting the infection that was slowly poisoning him. The cowboy held him through it, not knowing what else to do, his arms around the wounded warrior in a gesture that would have been impossible to explain to anyone from either of their worlds. But here, in this moment, stripped of everything except survival and humanity, it was the only thing that made sense. One man helping another through suffering. One soul refusing to let another slip away alone into darkness. The shaking eventually subsided, and the Apache's breathing eased slightly, enough that the cowboy felt it was safe to let sleep claim them both for a few precious hours. When dawn came, they would have to move again, would have to somehow circle around the soldiers and continue their impossible journey. But for now, in the depth of night, they existed in a space outside of time and consequence, just two men sharing warmth against the cold indifference of the frontier. The days that followed blurred together into an endless test of will and endurance that redefined what the cowboy thought possible to survive. They moved through country that seemed designed by a hostile god, canyons that ended in impassable falls, mesas that offered no water, valleys that funneled the sun's heat like a furnace. The Apache's condition fluctuated wildly, lucid 1 hour, delirious the next, his fever breaking only to return with renewed fury. The cowboy rationed their water with miserly precision, calculating survival in mouthfuls and drops. His own body began to fail in small ways, cracked lips that bled, skin burned raw by sun and wind, muscles that cramped and refused to obey. But he kept them moving, driven by something beyond reason, beyond self-preservation. He had made a promise, though no words had sealed it. He had committed himself to this man's survival, and he would see it through or die trying. On the 4th day after leaving the line shack, they heard the pursuit for the first time. It came as a distant sound of hoofbeats and shouting, echoing strangely through the canyons, impossible to pinpoint but undeniably there. The posse had found their trail. The cowboy pushed them harder, leading the horse up a narrow defile that might lose their tracks, might confuse the pursuers, might buy them time. That night, sheltering in a cave that stank of old animal dens, the Apache spoke. Not in English or any language the cowboy understood, but in the Apache tongue, soft words that came between labored breaths. The cowboy didn't know what was being said, but he understood the tone, gratitude, explanation, maybe apology. He responded in English, equally meaningless to the listener, words that tried to convey that no thanks were needed, that he had made his choice freely, that he would see it through. They sat in the darkness of that cave, two men speaking different languages into the void, and somehow understanding each other perfectly despite the wall of words between them. It was one of the strangest moments of the cowboy's life, intimate and profound in a way that transcended communication, touching something deeper than language could reach. The next morning brought new horror. The Apache's wound had become infected despite all the cowboy's efforts. Red lines radiated from the injury, poison spreading through flesh that was already too weakened to fight effectively. The outlaw needed real medicine, a doctor, things that were as distant and unreachable as the moon. The cowboy cleaned the wound again with their precious water, but he knew it wasn't enough. He was watching a man die slowly, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Except keep moving, keep fighting, keep refusing to accept defeat. They crossed into different country on the 6th day higher elevation where pine trees grew and the air carried the scent of something besides dust and rock. The Apache seemed to recognize it. his fever-bright eyes showing a spark of something that might have been hope. They were nearing his people's territory, the cowboy realized. If they could just reach it, just find help, there might be a chance. But the pursuit was closer now. The cowboy could feel it like pressure building before a storm. That afternoon, topping a rise to scout their route, he saw them, a large group, maybe 15 riders, moving with purpose along a parallel canyon. They hadn't spotted him yet, but it was only a matter of time. The territory was narrowing, the options for escape diminishing with every mile. He returned to where he had left the Apache and made a decision that felt like tearing something essential from his own chest. They needed to split up. The horse was leaving tracks too obvious to miss. If the cowboy drew the pursuers away, led them on a false trail, the Apache might have a chance to reach his people on foot. It was a desperate gamble, likely suicide for both of them, but it was the only option left. He tried to explain this to the Apache through gestures and the few words they had developed between them, a crude language built from necessity. The outlaw understood immediately, his face hardening with refusal. He gestured sharply, together. They would face whatever came together. The cowboy shook his head, insistent, trying to make him understand that this was the only way. Their argument played out in silence and gestures, two stubborn men refusing to abandon the other despite all logic demanding it. Finally, the cowboy did something he had never done in all their time together. He drew his rifle and pointed it at the Apache, not in threat but in command. Leave, survive, let the sacrifice matter. The Apache stared at him for a long moment, understanding passing through his fevered eyes. Then, slowly, painfully, he dismounted from the horse. He stood there swaying, clearly too weak for what the cowboy was demanding, but with a warrior's pride refusing to show it. The cowboy handed him a canteen, the last of their jerky, and pointed northwest, the direction where his people's territory lay, where help might be found if he could reach it. The Apache took the supplies, then did something unexpected. He reached into his own clothing and pulled out a small leather pouch, worn and precious, and pressed it into the cowboy's hand. Their eyes met, and in that exchange, all the things that couldn't be said in words passed between them anyway. Respect, gratitude, brotherhood forged in impossible circumstances. Then the Apache turned and began walking, his gait unsteady but determined, disappearing into the tree line. The cowboy watched him go, committing the sight to memory, then mounted his horse and turned south toward the pursuers, toward danger, toward the fate he had chosen when he decided to save a dying man. The chase that followed was brutal and surreal, a desperate flight through country that alternated between breathtaking beauty and deadly treachery. The cowboy pushed his horse hard, leaving obvious tracks making noise, ensuring the posse would follow him instead of searching for a second trail. Behind him, the shouts grew closer, more excited. They had found him, were closing the distance. He led them on a wild path through canyons and across ridges, buying time with every mile, every minute. His horse began to flag, foam flecking its sides, its breathing labored. The cowboy knew he was asking too much of the animal, but there was no choice. If he slowed, they would catch him. If they caught him, they would backtrack and find the Apache. Near sunset, his horse stepped wrong on a loose stone and went down hard, screaming as its legs snapped with a sound like a rifle shot. The cowboy was thrown clear, landing hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs and send his rifle skittering across the rocks. He lay there for a moment, stunned, hearing the terrible sounds of his dying horse, hearing the approaching riders who would be on him in minutes. He forced himself up, stumbled to his horse, and did the mercy he owed it, a quick bullet that silenced the screaming and left him standing, alone in the growing darkness with an empty rifle and no way to run. The riders would be here soon. He had led them away from the Apache, had bought time, but now he would pay the price for that choice. The cowboy found a defensive position among the rocks, reloaded his rifle, and prepared to make whatever stand he could. He thought about the Apache, hoped he had reached safety, hoped the sacrifice wouldn't be wasted. He thought about his life, the choices that had led him here, and found that he had no regrets. He had lived according to his own code, had chosen mercy over safety, had proven to himself that he was more than the hollow man the war had left behind. The riders appeared as the last light faded dark shapes against the deepening blue, moving cautiously now that they knew their quarry was cornered. The cowboy recognized Garrett in the lead, recognized the hate in his posture even from a distance. They would kill him, he knew. Not quickly or legally, but as revenge for his betrayal, for choosing an Apache over his own kind. He waited, rifle ready, prepared to take as many as he could before they overwhelmed him. But as Garrett raised his hand to order the charge, something impossible happened. From the rocks above the posse, from positions they must have moved into while everyone focused on the cowboy, came the Apache, not Ghostwalker, but others of his people, armed and ready, surrounding the settlers who had become the surrounded. The cowboy's breath caught. The Apache must have reached his people, must have brought them back, must have convinced them to save the man who had saved him. The standoff stretched taut as a drawn bowstring, both sides armed, both sides ready to kill, the darkness gathering around them all like a closing fist. Then Ghostwalker himself appeared, moving among his warriors despite his obvious weakness, and he spoke words in Apache that carried authority and command. The cowboys couldn't understand them, but they understood the tone. Leave now or die here. No middle ground. No negotiation. Garrett's face twisted with rage and frustration, but he wasn't stupid. He was outmaneuvered, outgunned, and the darkness favored the Apache who knew this country like the lines of their own hands. With a curse that carried across the space between them, he wheeled his horse and the posse retreated, their hoofbeats fading into the growing night. The cowboy stood there, hardly believing he was still alive, hardly believing what had just happened. The Apache warriors approached cautiously, and Ghostwalker came with them, moving slowly but under his own power. When he reached the cowboy, he simply nodded. That same small gesture weighted with everything that couldn't be said. Then he gestured for the cowboy to follow. They traveled through the night, moving with a certainty that suggested intimate knowledge of every stone and shadow. The cowboy, exhausted and aching from his fall, followed in a daze. They reached an Apache camp as dawn was breaking, a collection of dwellings hidden in a canyon so well concealed he never would have found it on his own. Women and children emerged, curious and wary, watching this white man who had been brought into their sanctuary. Ghostwalker spoke to his people, and though the cowboy understood none of the words, he felt the weight of the story being told. He had saved one of their warriors. He had risked everything to protect him. He had led pursuers away at the cost of his own safety. The faces around him shifted from suspicion to something more complex: respect, curiosity, acceptance of a debt that must be honored. They gave him food and water, tended to his injuries, and offered him a place to rest. The cowboy ate mechanically, his body taking what it needed while his mind struggled to process everything that had happened. He had expected to die, had been prepared for it. This reprieve felt surreal, like he had slipped sideways into a different story than the one he thought he was living. Ghostwalker sat with him as he ate, the outlaw looking better than he had in days, the fever finally broken, the wound healing under his people's care. Between them lay Ghostwalker's medicine pouch, the one he had pressed into the cowboy's hand during their parting. The cowboy pushed it back across the space between them, trying to return what had been given, but the Apache refused with a sharp gesture. It was a gift, a bond, a promise that their paths were forever intertwined. They sat together in the growing daylight, surrounded by a people who had every reason to hate the cowboy's kind, and yet who were offering him sanctuary because one of their own had asked it. The complexity of it made his head swim. The war between Apache and settler hadn't ended, wouldn't end for years, if ever. Blood would continue to flow on both sides. And yet here, in this moment, two men from opposite sides had found something that transcended the conflict: basic humanity, recognition of shared suffering, the profound connection that came from saving and being saved. The cowboy stayed with the Apache for 3 days, recovering his strength, learning things about these people that contradicted everything he had heard in the settlements. They weren't monsters or savages. They were families, communities, people trying to survive in a world that was systematically destroying their way of life. He saw children playing games that could have been played anywhere, saw mothers tending to their babies with the same fierce love any mother showed, saw warriors laughing around evening fires with the same camaraderie he had known among soldiers. The Ghost Walker, as he healed, began to teach the cowboy things, Apache words for water, food, friend, danger. Simple vocabulary that created the beginning of real communication between them. In return, the cowboy taught English words, though he suspected the Apache already knew more English than he let on. They developed a pattern of companionship that was easy and natural, despite all the reasons it should have been impossible. On the 3rd night, sitting by a fire under stars that seemed close enough to touch, Ghost Walker told his story, not in words the cowboy could fully understand, but through gestures and the few shared words they had, through expression and tone. The cowboy pieced together a tale of loss and violence, of family killed in a raid gone wrong, of vengeance sought against those who had destroyed everything he loved, of being labeled an outlaw for fighting back against the forces trying to erase his people. It was a story the cowboy recognized, even in its incompleteness. It was the story of the war, of every war, people fighting to protect what mattered to them, becoming monsters in each other's eyes, the cycle of violence perpetuating itself until no one could remember who struck first or why it mattered. Ghost Walker had killed, yes, but he had killed in a war that wasn't of his making, in defense of a world being stolen piece by piece. Understanding wasn't the same as absolution. The cowboy wouldn't claim that the deaths Ghost Walker had caused were justified or necessary. But he understood now the man behind the legend, the pain behind the violence, and that understanding changed something fundamental in how he saw the conflict that had defined this territory for so long. When it came time to leave and the cowboy knew he had to leave, knew he couldn't stay in this place no matter how much sanctuary it offered, Ghost Walker walked with him to the edge of the camp. They stood together in the early morning light, 2 men who had saved each other in different ways, who had formed a bond that couldn't be explained to anyone from either of their worlds. The Apache offered him a horse, a gift the cowboy tried to refuse, but Ghost Walker insisted upon with gestures that made the obligation clear. The cowboy accepted it with gratitude that he tried to convey through his eyes since words would fail. Then came the hard part, saying goodbye to someone who had become something like a brother in the space of 2 desperate weeks. They clasped forearms in a warrior's grip, their eyes meeting with perfect understanding. They would probably never see each other again. Their worlds were too separate, the war between their peoples too entrenched. But what they had shared, the rescue, the flight, the sacrifice, the bond would remain with both of them for whatever time they had left in this hard country. The cowboy mounted the horse and turned east, toward the territories where white settlers held sway, toward a future uncertain and probably dangerous. He couldn't go back to his ranch, couldn't return to his old life. Word of his betrayal would have spread. He was marked now suspect, a man who had chosen an Apache over his own kind. He would have to find new country, build a new life, start again from nothing. But as he rode away from the Apache camp, the medicine pouch secure in his pocket as a reminder of all that had passed, he found he didn't regret any of it. The cost had been high: his home, his safety, his place in the world he had known. But what he had gained was higher still, the knowledge that he could still choose mercy over convenience, could still stand for something when it mattered, could still recognize the humanity in someone the world had labeled an enemy. Behind him, he knew, Ghost Walker stood watching his departure, a figure silhouetted against the rising sun. The cowboy didn't look back. Some goodbyes were better left clean, without the messy reality of final glances and delayed departures. He rode east, into the growing light, carrying with him a story that would never be told, a sacrifice that would never be acknowledged, a bond that would remain secret until both men were dust. The weeks that followed were a study in careful survival and cautious movement through a territory that had become hostile in ways both obvious and subtle. The cowboy avoided settlements, avoided trails, avoided any contact with other people as he worked his way northeast toward lands less populated and less defined by the conflicts that had marked the Southwest. He lived off the land, hunting small game, finding water and springs that didn't appear on any map, sleeping rough under stars that offered no judgment. Sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep came, he would take out Ghost Walker's medicine pouch and hold it, feeling the weight of what it represented. Inside were items of spiritual significance he couldn't name: small stones, fragments of something organic, a feather wrapped with careful precision. He didn't open it. The contents weren't meant for him. The pouch itself was the message. You are not alone. You are not forgotten. What we shared matters. He crossed into new territories as winter approached, finding work on ranches that didn't ask too many questions about a man's past. He worked hard, kept to himself, and slowly began to rebuild something like a life. But he was changed in ways that couldn't be hidden completely. He wouldn't participate in conversations that dehumanized the Apache or any Indian people. He wouldn't join in the casual racism that infected settler talk like a disease. He defended those who couldn't defend themselves, even when it would have been easier to stay silent. This earned him a reputation as strange, difficult, potentially dangerous. But it also earned him respect from a few, those who recognized integrity when they saw it, who understood that a man who stood by his principles, even when it cost him, was rare and valuable. He found himself drawn to other outcasts, other men and women who lived on the edges of settler society, mixed-blood families, missionaries who actually respected the native peoples they worked with, former slaves who had come west seeking freedom only to find different flavors of prejudice. Among these people, slowly, carefully, the cowboy built something new. Not the isolation he had sought before, but a different kind of community, one based on shared values rather than shared blood, on chosen bonds rather than accidents of birth. He never told them about Ghost Walker, never spoke of those desperate weeks or the choice that had upended his life. But they sensed something in him, recognized a fellow traveler on the hard road of trying to live with honor in a dishonorable world. Years passed. The frontier began to close, the wild spaces shrinking as settlement expanded. The wars with the Apache wound down not through victory, but through exhaustion and overwhelming numbers, through the systematic destruction of a way of life that couldn't survive the tide of change. The cowboy heard stories sometimes, tales of Ghost Walker and his warriors, of raids and battles and eventual surrender. He never knew which stories were true, never knew if the man he had saved survived the final years of conflict or died fighting as he had lived. But he thought about him often, wondered if Ghost Walker ever thought about those weeks they spent together, wondered if the Apache told stories of the white man who chose mercy when it made no sense, who sacrificed everything for someone he had no reason to save, wondered if, somewhere in the remaining free spaces of the territory, Ghost Walker still carried the memory of their bond like a talisman against despair. The cowboy grew older, his hair going gray, his body accumulating the aches and pains of hard living. He never married, never settled in one place too long, never stopped moving through a world that had become softer and more civilized and somehow more disappointing. The wild frontier of his youth was being paved over, fenced in, domesticated into something that bore little resemblance to the raw and terrible beauty he had known. Sometimes he would ride out alone into what wild country remained, seeking the echo of those days when everything was simpler because it was reduced to survival and choice. He would make camp under stars that hadn't changed even if everything beneath them had. And he would take out Ghost Walker's medicine pouch, worn now, faded, but still intact, and he would remember. He remembered the moment he decided to save a dying man. Remembered the weight of that choice, the cascade of consequences that followed. remembered the bond that formed between two people who had every reason to be enemies, but found something deeper than enmity when stripped down to their essential humanity. Remembered the sacrifice, the rescue, the parting that felt like losing something irreplaceable. And he would ask himself the question that had haunted him across all the years: was it worth it? The cost had been everything he had built, everything he thought he wanted. The gain had been intangible, ephemeral, a brief connection, a moment of moral clarity, the knowledge that he had chosen right over easy. The answer came easier with each passing year: yes. It was worth it, all of it. Because that choice, that sacrifice, had proven something essential about who he was and who he wanted to be. It had shown him that mercy was possible even in the hardest circumstances, that humanity could bridge even the widest divides, that honor mattered more than safety or comfort or belonging. He had saved Ghostwalker, and in doing so, had saved something in himself, some essential core that the war had tried to destroy, that isolation had tried to bury, that the brutal logic of the frontier had tried to erase. He had proven he could still feel, still care, still choose the harder right over the easier wrong. And that knowledge, carried across decades, sustained him through all the years that followed. The end came quietly, as endings often do for men who have lived hard lives. The cowboy, old now and worn down by decades of frontier existence, found himself in a small town at the edge of what had once been Apache territory. The wars were long over, the conflicts resolved through treaties and surrenders and the inexorable push of settlement. The Apache had been moved to reservations, their way of life confined and controlled, their warrior culture reduced to memory and story. The cowboy had taken a room at a boarding house, his body finally demanding rest after decades of constant motion. His chest had been hurting for weeks, a deep ache that suggested something failing in the machinery of his heart. He knew, with the certainty of someone who had seen death often enough to recognize its approach, that his time was near. He spent his last days in a chair by the window, watching the town go about its business, thinking about the long, strange path his life had taken. Everything had changed. The frontier he had known was gone, replaced by something tamer and more predictable. The wars were over. The wild spaces were fenced. The world had moved on, as worlds do, leaving old men like him behind as relics of a rougher time. On what would be his final afternoon, someone knocked on his door, a young Apache man, dressed in the clothes of the reservation, his long hair cut short in the style that the government schools demanded. He spoke English with barely an accent, and he carried a message from Ghostwalker. The old warrior was still alive, still on the reservation, and he had somehow learned that the cowboy who saved him was dying in this town. He wanted the cowboy to know that he remembered, that the bond still held, that what they had shared mattered. The young man also brought something else, a photograph, new technology capturing old truths. It showed Ghostwalker, ancient now but still fierce, standing with his family, children and grandchildren, a legacy that had survived despite everything. And in his hands, worn but unmistakable, was a medicine pouch the cowboy recognized. Tears came then, unexpected and unstoppable, decades of held emotion finally breaking through the dam of stoic silence. The cowboy wept for what had been lost, the wild country, the simple choices, the intensity of those desperate weeks. But he also wept for what had been gained, the knowledge that his sacrifice had mattered, that Ghostwalker had survived, had lived long enough to have a family, to pass something forward into a future that neither of them could have predicted. He tried to send a message back, but words failed him. What could he say that would capture the weight of everything he felt? The young Apache man seemed to understand. He simply nodded, took the cowboy's weathered hand in his own, and said that Ghostwalker knew, had always known. The bond forged in blood and sacrifice didn't need words. It transcended them. That night, the cowboy died peacefully in his sleep, Ghostwalker's medicine pouch clutched in his hand, a small smile on his weathered face. They buried him in the town cemetery, A simple grave with a simple marker that told none of his story. No one who attended the sparse funeral knew about the Apache outlaw he had saved, the life he had given up, the price his heart had paid. But somewhere on a reservation far from that grave, Ghost Walker heard the news and stood for a long moment in silence, remembering the white cowboy who chose mercy when hate would have been easier, who sacrificed everything to save someone he had no reason to care about, who proved that even in the midst of war and conflict and divided loyalties, basic human decency could still prevail. Ghost Walker had lived long enough to see his people's way of life destroyed, but he had also lived long enough to see his grandchildren grow, to pass down stories of the old days, to preserve what could be preserved of culture and tradition. And among those stories, told quietly to those who could be trusted with it, was the tale of the cowboy who saved him, who led pursuers away at the cost of his own life, who formed a bond across an unbridgeable divide. The story would be told for generations, not in public, not in the official histories that would be written about the wars and settlements and treaties, but in quiet moments around family fires, when the question arose about whether enemies could ever truly see each other's humanity. Someone would remember Ghost Walker's tale, would remember that once, in the dying days of the frontier, one man chose mercy over hatred, sacrifice over safety, and in doing so proved that bridges could be built even across the widest chasms. The sun sets over the land that once knew the thunder of horses and the crack of rifles, that once ran red with blood spilled by men who saw each other as enemies first and human beings second. The frontier is gone now, paved over by progress and time, its stories fading like old photographs left too long in the sun. But some stories resist fading. Some bonds refuse to break, even when severed by death and distance and decades. The story of the cowboy and the Apache outlaw is one of those, a tale of mercy in merciless times, of sacrifice that cost everything and gained something priceless, of two men who proved that the deepest human connections can form in the most unlikely circumstances. It reminds us that every person we meet carries within them a whole world, histories we'll never know, pain we'll never understand, dreams we'll never witness. The choice to see that, to honor it, to extend mercy, even when it makes no sense, is what separates us from the worst versions of ourselves. The cowboy paid with his heart, quite literally in the end. But what he purchased with that payment was invaluable. The knowledge that he had lived according to his deepest values, that he had chosen right over easy, that he had seen humanity in someone the world told him was just an enemy. In a life measured not by years, but by moments of moral clarity, he had earned something most people never achieve, the certainty that he had been, in the ways that truly mattered, good. Ghost Walker carried that gift forward, not just the life the cowboy saved, but the lesson embedded in that salvation. He passed it to his children and grandchildren, a story about the possibility of connection across even the most hostile divides, about the power of one person choosing mercy in a world that demanded vengeance. And so the echo continues, rippling forward through time. Every act of unexpected mercy, every choice to see humanity in those we're taught to fear, every sacrifice made not for personal gain, but because it's right. These are the real victories in a world that often seems determined to divide us. The frontier may be gone, but the truths it taught remain. We all face choices between the easy path and the right one, between safety and principle, between protecting ourselves and extending mercy to those who may not deserve it by any logical standard, but who need it desperately nonetheless. The cowboy made his choice on a dusty mesa, kneeling beside a dying man who was supposed to be his enemy. Everything that followed, the sacrifice, the bond, the cost, the meaning flowed from that single moment of decision. And in the end, as his heart gave out and the photograph of Ghost Walker's family lay beside him, he knew his choice had rippled forward into futures he would never see, touching lives he would never meet, proving that mercy is never wasted, even when its fruits are invisible. This is the legacy we all leave behind, not wealth or fame or power, but the moments when we chose to be more than survival demanded, when we extended our hand to someone we could have passed by, when we paid the price for our principles even when no one was watching. The cowboy saved the Apache outlaw, but his heart paid the price. And that price purchased something eternal, proof that even in the hardest times, in the most divided worlds, one person choosing mercy over hatred can change everything. The sun sets. The story remains. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, two spirits, one white, one Apache, stand together, beyond conflict and pain, united by a bond that death itself couldn't sever. This is how legends are born, not from great battles or famous victories, but from quiet moments of courage when one human being chose to save another, regardless of cost. This is how we become more than what the world makes us, by choosing mercy when hatred would be easier, by seeing humanity when seeing an enemy would be simpler, by paying whatever price our hearts demand to live as we believe we should. The frontier is gone, but the truth it taught us remains, echoing across the years. Mercy is never wasted, honor is never foolish, and the bridges we build between ourselves and those we're supposed to hate may cost us everything, but they purchase something that lasts forever.
Thanks for watching this story till the end. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And before you go, check out these other amazing Western stories waiting for you next. Subscribe, like, and I'll see you on the next ride.